Hi everybody and welcome back to the Activist Lawyer podcast. Today we have part 2 of our special edition episode with Phil Scraton. The response for part 1 was so incredible that we just wanted to come on and say thank you so much for all of your support, and we hope that you enjoy part 2. Make sure to follow us on social media and check out part 1 at activistlawyer.com. So Phil, you've been involved in many projects that we're going to touch on here in part 2, but firstly we know that you've played a key role in the Irish Council for Civil Liberties report and the research into death investigations and the right of the bereaved. So for our listeners out there who aren't familiar, could you provide some insight into this report and why it's so significant?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of what we're talking about here is that the report that has just recently been published, Death Investigation, Coroner's Inquest and the Rights of the Bereaved. It's a research report for the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and it's the culmination of 2 years' work, and it was delayed because I was ill and a lot of other issues. But anyway, what we've come out with, which I think is unique, is the recommendation for a very precise charter in these situations for the bereaved. In other words, a 7-point charter that commits the government and its agencies to a whole range of issues, but the statements of rights, identification, post-mortems, access to location of death, crisis support, also establishes an appropriate time frame for coronial investigation, because one of the biggest problems in these cases, as Hillsborough shows, is delay. And I think we also believe that very strongly from the work that we did with families in the South, that the Charter should affirm those who were bereaved, injured and affected by disaster have a right to privacy, intrusive journalism, all of those issues. So we cover a whole range of issues, but at the heart of it is a 6-point plan for the structural reform of the management and delivery of the coroner's service, a 7-point plan for further staffing and training of the coroner's service, and a 16-point plan for protecting the rights of bereaved families, including information provision and support. Then, obviously, significantly improving the human rights compliant practices inquests. And then also, and we make 12 recommendations on that. Then also we address the issue of the media, and then further research that could be conducted, particularly around institutionalized racism, where we're dealing with the Irish traveller community, for example. So what we did for this report was we went back 20 years to the earliest intervention, which was an intervention that was established to reform the coroner's service in 2000. The review was published in 2000. It was a root and branch. Series of recommendations for reform, for changes in the legislation, etc. And it had short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. And it gave a 20-year span, which would have taken us to 2020 for the full implementation. What we show is that throughout that 20 years has been prevarication in the South, even down to building a new central coroner's offices and court, and then with the slump, deciding it couldn't be completed and then pulling it down. So, we've gone through all of this, and there's been some legislation that has been partial, that has been delivered. But at the heart of our report is that root and branch change, and it's fundamentally born out of our interviews with families who've been through the process. I mean, also with lawyers who have had to represent families who've been through the process and who are appalled by the way in which the process operates. And I think that there are issues here about delay. There are issues here about conduct, families turning up and seeing other people around the court. And it's not often a real court. It's a village hall or whatever. And they see other people sitting around and they wonder who they are. And they realize there are other families here for other inquests, all on the same day. In other words, they're going to be open and shut cases. Juries that are the same people every, in some of the country areas, juries who are the same people, almost like a standing jury, brought in for cases who know the coroner knows them, and so on, and therefore they're malleable.
Yeah.
So all of that process is light years away from what a full-time, fully functioning, fully financed coronial process should look like. Mm-hmm. And when we gave evidence to the government committee just a few weeks ago, what they were saying to us was, yes, but we have other priorities for reform in Ireland, and, I'm afraid coroners, at a time of a pandemic, et cetera, coroners are way down our list.
Yeah.
And I think that's people understand that and they accept that until it's them, until it's their family. And what I say to people, none of us know when we might become entangled with the coronial process.
Sure.
Nobody knows when a sudden death or a death in unexplained circumstances or a death in a crush, whatever, could happen. And of course, I'm involved now with the team who are working on the Stardust inquiry, and the Stardust is for everybody who knows about death in social circumstances in Ireland, Stardust remains a blight in terms of its initial investigation and inquiry. A blight, it's a stain on the process of inquiry and investigation, and those new inquests are about to start. And it was a good decision that the strength of argument for new inquests was accepted and taken. And I think now, after all these years campaigning, the Stardust families have got a process that they at least feel is going to recognise that go to the heart of the key issues that occurred around Stardust. So that's an interesting juxtaposition for me to be observing and working with the legal teams on Stardust at the same time as producing the death investigation and coronal inquests report.
Absolutely. It's an interesting emergence of the two. And just you mentioned there again that it's people-centric and it's about bringing people, victims, families, survivors to the fore. And in any of these inquiries and investigations and any of the research into that. And it just brings to mind, I was happy to see, I think it was Twitter or some kind of social media outlet that I saw it on, the establishment by the Northern Ireland Executive of Truth Recovery Panel. So the independent panel, I think it's 3 people sit on that. You're one of them. To start this whole process, and I know there's been work done on it, and I know some of the legal team involved in handling cases for survivors and families of the mother and baby homes and Magdalen Laundry. So, I mean, I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about your involvement. I know it's very new, but I think it's a very positive step forward to actually start from scratch and to maybe take some learnings from what happened in the Republic of Ireland in terms of the Commissioner's report there. So how's that going?
Well, I think it's significant that the 2 academic voices out of the 3-person panel, it's chaired by Deirdre Mahon, who is a former senior, or is a senior social worker in the North. And that was a controversial choice because obviously social work as an agency and as a profession is under scrutiny in all of this. But it's precisely because it's under scrutiny that we would have needed somebody of that stature involved. But the other, apart from myself, the other academic is Maeve O'Rourke, Dr. Maeve O'Rourke, who works at the University of Galway, and people will know her work for long-standing campaign work regarding mother and babies institutions and Magdalenes in the south. We are very much at this embryonic stage of it. We have the website now established and set up so people can go to the website and see what it is we're about. It's unique because for the very first time, we're engaged in a process which has been called, it's not a phrase I particularly like, co-design.
Yeah.
And what that means is that we're working with all of those individuals, and in some case families, who've come forward to actually progress their cases, and they've come forward to give information and to provide direction to us, and we are working together to establish what the next stage should be. Initially, there was skepticism because people were sort of saying, we've had the major report, the academic report into mother and babies, let's just go straight to a public inquiry. And indeed, a whole over 200 families represented by one legal practice, they wanted to go straight for a public inquiry. That was fair enough, and we respect that, and that is really significant. But what was really important was to say, well, let's just spend these 6 months. This is not me saying this, but this was what was said. Let's spend these 6 months. We have the endorsement uniquely in Northern Ireland. We have the endorsement of all the political parties together. So let's go forward and plan this next stage. What should it be? Should it be some form of independent panel? Should it be some form of public inquiry? What kind of public inquiry? What statutory role should it have? Or should it be some other form of commission? But this needs to be developed not just by those of us like myself and Maeve who have experience of these issues and experience of all of the literature that surrounds them, but alongside those who are most affected. In other words, the individuals and families. And it's a challenge because, first of all, it's a challenge that they should trust us when they've been let down so much in the past.
Sure.
Secondly, it's a challenge to actually do it because there will be a wide range of opinion, and we've gone far and wide, including across the world, to invite people to submit their stories, to submit what they want. And so we're going to, in a 6-month period, and we will do it by the end of September, we're going to make a full report which will recommend what the next stage should be. And I think that when people say, oh, well, it's obvious, we don't really need to have this sort of an intervention to do that, when one gets into all of this detail, as you know only too well in the law, it's complex.
Yeah.
And how best are families' views going to be represented? I mentioned a minute ago how Le Guerin in Jersey, where there was no potential in an official inquiry, but families were able to give their full stories. But I'm not in any way recommending that. But what I'm saying is that gives us an illustration of the broad range that not just the three of us, but also the families need to work through before we get into the detail of the recommendation.
Yeah.
And of course, people can, I think, and you will know this only too well, that when any major event happens, people cry out public inquiry because they think that is going to resolve everything, but they don't have, and why would they, a real knowledge of what constitutes a public inquiry and the problems associated with public inquiries, who chairs it, who the expert people are who work to the chair. What are the terms of reference of a public inquiry, often so constraining that issues that people want addressed can't be addressed? How is the evidence taken before a public inquiry? How are people examined in a public inquiry as they would be cross-examined in a court of liability? Yeah. So how does that operate? And we need to work through all of those processes in order to establish what those who are most affected by the mother and babies issue, what they feel is going to be the most appropriate avenue. And it might not just be one-dimensional. There might be other avenues that we would add to the process. So we're very much in the medium stage of that at the moment. We're very much in the evidence-gathering stage. And what I can say very clearly is that the stories, as you would expect, and as we know from the various TV and radio programs and films, the stories are devastating.
Absolutely.
And the long-term impact is devastating. Yeah. And it can be anything from what really did happen, what happened across borders, what happened internationally, right across the board to very, very obvious issues like I can't access any of my records.
Yeah.
Surely I have a right to my records. And then in accessing records, finding that they are redacted. You know, those processes, which are about institutional institutions pulling up the drawbridge, that is unacceptable.
Yeah.
And so we have to look at the best way forward, and we're right in the middle of that work at the moment.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's survivor-centric, and I think that was one of the failings of some of the inquiries and investigations that took place in the Republic of Ireland. And
Yes.
you know, that's so fresh in our minds. I mean, it was January earlier this year that we heard victims and survivors talking about how they weren't listened to, how the facts weren't relayed correctly, etc., etc. So whatever way we look at it, at least this is a valid attempt to bring those stories into the formation of how, you know, this inquiry takes place. And I think that's crucial. And we look forward to following that.
I think the important phrase there is in the title of what we're trying to achieve. It's a truth recovery strategy.
Yeah.
In other words, what is being said from the outset is the truth is out there. And that some of those families know the truth only too well. It's their lived truth. They lived through it. They know that truth. But what is important is to recover the institutional context in which that happened. And people think, oh, well, what we're talking about here, you know, is the Catholic Church or other churches, or it is the Salvation Army, or it is Bernardo's, or whoever. But let's just pause for a minute, I say to people, and think none of those institutions could operate without the collusion, and it was collusion, of medical practitioners, of social workers, of priests and ministers, and of a range of others in authority who, if you like, plowed the ground upon which this atrocity could grow. You know, and I think that it's important that we realize that by homing in on one institution and one organization, however horrendous the stories from that organization are, we have to remember that that organization was being serviced, and it was being serviced by state actors. You know, it wasn't just being serviced by a particular religion or a particular historical organization. It was being serviced by the context of the time. And it's not sufficient, as I've always argued in my work on truth recovery, it's not just sufficient to say, oh, that happened then. That was in the past. You know, and to say, well, we'll have an apology for what happened in the past. And that will lay it to rest. Well, it won't lay it to rest when somebody at this particular moment in time or over the last couple of years has discovered their own history and want to know what on earth happened to my mother, what on earth happened to my sister or brother. Who am I? You know, and I think the hardest thing for me to face, because I know my history. I knew my mother and father. I knew my sister. I knew my local. Yeah, there were parts of my personal history which I don't know, and I probably don't want to know. But that's not the point. I have a good knowledge and understanding. When at the age of 50 or 60, you suddenly discovered that the history you thought you had, is not your history. The impact of that is remarkable. To say to somebody, oh, just deal with it and move on, is an outrage. You can't do that once you discover the truth or the part truth. And what that sets you on the road to is full discovery of the truth.
Absolutely. Well, we look forward to seeing how that work develops with great interest here. And we've had speakers on before. It's something that's really relevant to what we're trying to do here as well, is to try and expose that type of work that's going on. So thank you for sharing the details around that.
Thank you, Phil. And obviously before we finish off, it's important to touch on activism, as obviously this is the Activist Lawyer podcast, and one thing that stands out to Sarah and I is your reluctance to be silenced and to say things that need to be said even when it's not the popular thing to do. So Phil, how would you speaking to our listeners that are listening now, how would you inspire those to carry out the same work that you do, uncovering truths and that reluctance to be silenced by others?
Well, it's a good question. I never really set out to even work through the answer, Jack, and when I first started. What I would say is carefully, never overclaim, never make allegations that you can't substantiate. There's lots about Hillsborough I know, but I can't substantiate it, so I can't put it into the public domain. We are, the work I do, I suppose people describe me, and some of the articles I've written are about being an activist. An activist academic. So you're using academic work not only for publications and for the benefit of your university and knowledge and all the rest, but you're also doing it because you believe that it has an activist end goal. But encouraging people, my own students, for example, many of my former students, some of whom now are professors, because that's how old I am. I think it's about carrying a torch, and it's about carrying the torch for truth. Yeah. I think that's really, really significant, but activism has to be done carefully. Our institutions mitigate against it. I know there have been serious complaints made about me in my successive universities, and I know who made those complaints, and I know they've been made to the highest level. I understand that, and I know that happens. And as a professor, you just have to say, well, I'm in a senior position, and are you going to take me on? Okay. But if you're a young academic with a career in the balance and promotion in the balance, that is much more difficult. So it has to be done with stealth, and it has to be done carefully, and certainly not to be brash, but never to overclaim. The inequalities and structural inequities of our system are so great. You don't need to overclaim them. They speak for themselves, as we've heard in the last minutes. Yeah. And of course, I would encourage people to do this work. One of the great things, I suppose it's one of the privileges of doing the work is when you do a math lecture, and sometimes when I'm talking about math lecture, I'm talking about thousands of people, that when you finish, that there's a queue at the table of people asking advice about how to go forward or writing to you afterwards and so on. And I think it's about truth, it's about never overclaiming, but it's also about being careful and cognizant that people are lent on. I mean, my children, I was alone with my children when they were very young, when I had a phone call to an ex-directory number that was a death threat. And it told me what time I took the kids to school. It told me all of the detail of where I lived and everything else, and it was a cultured voice. That shook me, not because I thought that the death threat was real, but it shook me because it was a reminder that you're being watched, you're being observed. And that's gone on ever since, less now than it used to. It used to, but I also know that former senior people in the prison service approaching my vice chancellors and stating that I haven't even talked about my prisons work, that I should keep my nose out of their business, and often doing it not by name, not naming you because people know who it is they're referring to.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that with us, Phil. It's really hard to hear that you had to deal with that. So, Phil, just to finish off, we've one question to ask you, hoping you can answer. What was the highlight or highlights of your career so far?
If I'm being serious, it was the Hillsborough Independent panel, being the primary author of that report and delivering it in Liverpool Cathedral to the mass of Hillsborough families. And as I went through my overheads in the hour and a quarter that I delivered it, watching the incredulity and on the faces of those in the audience, and the 5-minute standing ovation that came at the end, not just for my work, but for the panel's work and for all that we had achieved. So that was a defining moment in the cathedral in Liverpool. And the other highlight, to be less serious was being invited onto Desert Island Discs. And
I love
that
Desert
was
Island Discs.
gobsmacking. So much so that when the phone call came through, I thought it was one of my pals winding me up. and that was the highlight.
That
because
is
it gave
a
me
highlight.
the opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, it gave me the opportunity to show that social justice and the politics of what I do is also bound up very much in the music to which I listen. And I opened it with Barry Kerr's The Leaving Song, which talks about Irish migration. And of course, that's where it all started when my mother's family, 2 generations ahead of her, got stuck in Liverpool on their way to the United States. And as they say, the rest is history.
And you were also provided with the was it the Freedom of the City of Liverpool, wasn't it, as well, Phil?
Yeah, that's I wasn't going to mention that. That is,
well, we're
having turned down. Well, I turned down an OBE that I just thought was outrageous. I mean, who on earth? I thought that was a good idea because it gave me the opportunity to expound on why I was wanting to turn it down and get into issues around British colonialism and what the British Empire really means. But also to make the serious point on top of that. That is a serious point, but the other serious point that I don't do the work for that kind of a reward. But the night that all the families gathered in St. George's Hall in Liverpool, and I was given the freedom of the city, that was special. And that's special because it's a recognition by your peers. It's not a recognition by, those on high who think it's a good thing to have your name on something. It was real in-depth recognition by my peers. And to have that awarded at the same time as posthumously, it was given to the 96 who died at Hillsborough, and also to Kenny Dalgleish and Marina Dalgleish for the work that they've done, not only on Hillsborough, but on a whole range of charities that they've been involved in. Was a great honour. Yeah, that was a great honour too.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much to be proud of. And it's just been fantastic having you share those achievements and your work to date, and your work continues. So it would be fantastic to have you on again to update us. I'm sure our listeners will be enthralled by what we've discussed today.
Definitely, thank you.
So thank you so much, Phil, again for giving up your time.
Well, to all of you, thank you so much for having me, to Jess and Jack. But I have to say, to whether it's both of you, Sarah, the one outside and the one inside, all the best wishes for the birth. And
I've held it together.
I hope it goes well. And I'm absolutely relieved that I didn't bring on I didn't bring on the birth in the studio. So thanks a million.
It's a relief. Thank you for that as well, Phil. We've so much to cover. We hope that you come on again to talk about the continuation of your work with the Truth Recovery Strategy and also other aspects of your work. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you all so much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed part 2 as much as we did. That is 20 episodes done and dusted of Activist Lawyer with some amazing guests coming up. So make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter at Activist Lawyer to keep updated for all upcoming guests. And remember, if you would like to contribute to our blogs or feature on one of our podcasts, please visit activistlawyer.com. Thank you all so much for listening.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.